All right.
Okay, and then we'll go ahead and get started. If you are so inclined, we do ask for some active participation today. So we'll ask you to, we'll do the official welcome here in just a moment. Please go to joinpd.com using either your mobile device or another browser window and join us there. Don't be shy, feel free to join, and that join code will be posted up in the upper right hand corner of the screen, and we'll come back to that a few different times throughout the session as you might need that. But we'd like to welcome you here to this session. I'm Randy, that's Anissa, and you're here to talk more about planning and monitoring active engagement during active learning. So for those of you that are new to us today or our first timers, I'm a senior instructional specialist with IRE. I have worked in the classroom in the Metro Detroit area for about 8 years. And for the past 4, now going into my 5th year with IRE, it's been that long. I support teachers and leaders at all levels of systems, just thinking about how to do good things even better. I'll let Anissa speak to her background a little bit before we get into the meat of today.
All right. Welcome, everybody. My name is Dr. Anissa Collins. I am the Director of Instruction here at IRE. I've been a teacher, science teacher, reading intervention, ESL, sheltered science, at primarily the secondary levels, have been an administrator and a coach. And so I'm very glad that you guys are here today and look forward to the conversation.
All right. So we'll go ahead and get started and talk first about those outcomes that we want to attend to today, whether you're here with us in person or attending on demand. We want to make sure that we have a clear vision of where we're going. So first, we want to speak to be able to develop and refine a definition of student engagement. It means a lot of different things to different people. It can look a lot of different ways, but we want to make sure that we're calibrated of our understanding here at the beginning. We'll want to identify some strategies for facilitating student engagement in the learning throughout, as well as identify some strategies, as our title implies, for monitoring student engagement throughout the learning as well. Our ground rules, just as we work together as a community of learners here today, will begin and end on time. We are scheduled for a 1-hour session from starting at 3:30. We'll end a few minutes early to allow for some question and answer time. But in order to make that time go well and us to be able to get there, please stay focused and be respectful. There will be some times where we'll ask you to drop some thinking into chat or use Pear to otherwise communicate with us. So please make sure that we're respectful and focused of everyone's time and learning when we're there. Please assume positive intent as we all share our own stories and experiences about our learning and when we do ask for some of that participation. Please use the chat features for questions and responses. And this is a reminder more for Anissa and I, because in a webinar, it can be one-sided, but to mute your microphones when not speaking, although certainly if you would like to, there's a burning thought you have and you want to put that out into space, please feel free to use the raise your hand function down below the Q&A bar. And we'll be happy to accommodate you at that point. And then mute you anyway afterward. So a few other housekeeping rules, just so you're aware. We do have some, we do want you to please keep sharing those questions and ideas in the chat. That back channel is a powerful conversation and learning tool for you to share some resources and thinking with the other participants in the room. We'll also track any questions and respond to any questions in the chat as we're able to, either at a logical pausing point, again at that Q&A session at the end of the session, or in some follow-up communication if we're not able to attend to do it in either of those points. Before the record, just because this is an on-demand session, there will be some of you viewing this a little bit later. We are saving that chat so it gets packaged with the video and put out to everyone as well. So don't put anything in there you want grandma to read. With that said, we'll go ahead and get into the meat of today. One thing we've been curious about as we are both hosting our own webinars but attending others is how in general participants perceive their roles in webinars. So we're going to ask you to take a moment to grab the purple dot from up in the upper right hand corner of your screen and to drag it to the square that most describes your expectation of your experience of a webinar. Do you play webinars in the background while you're doing other things? And that's perfectly okay. That's how I take in some webinars as well. Do you typically play webinars in the background, but you tune in for the important parts? So what sounds juicy to you up in the upper right-hand corner? Do you play webinars in the foreground, but don't typically participate? You might be kind of a shy and kind of a wallflower. Or are you in the bottom right-hand corner where you play webinars in the foreground and make sure to participate in chats, polls, and other things? This gives us a little, Anissa and I, some insight on what our audience is like and how they prefer to participate. So please give you another moment or so to tell us what you're thinking there. The dots here are going to stay completely anonymous to you. There will be some prompts later on where we'll share some thinking, but this is really to give Anissa and I a barometer of what our audience is like, and helps us tailor some of our experiences, especially for those of you who might tune out in the background. We'll try and bring you back to when we the juiciest parts of what we hope is a juicy presentation on the whole. So thank you for that feedback. We'll go ahead and use that to craft some of that. Anissa and I, as you see us speaking on other devices, can see some of those responses as well, to be perfectly transparent for those of you that are in the room with us or that are viewing this on demand later. If you see us looking away from the screen, it's because we're attending to some of those things. So on to our welcome and warm up today. We want you to think about some of these activities. Things like watching videos, taking notes from the board, independent reading or independent writing, peer conversations, viewing presentations, recording a video, or performing an experiment. Of those activities, which of them are most likely to increase or promote student engagement in the learning? You have 5 blue dots at the bottom. You don't have to use all of them. You can use any of them, all of them, one of them, none of them. Whatever makes sense to you. Which activities do you think from that selection are most likely to promote or increase student engagement in the learning? Give you a few moments to drag some thinking, some response there. And we'll let those dots settle down a little bit. And because there's a few of them moving around, I'm just going to highlight some of the answers here on our using Pear Deck here. Pear Deck didn't play well with me. Let's try that again. Okay. I will find ways to highlight that a little bit later. Pear Deck is not playing well with us here. But what we are seeing is a distribution of those dots. In the bottom right-hand corner, some of us are saying that recording a video, performing an experiment, definitely peer conversations will lead to some engagement, as well as watching videos as well. So what's noticeable here is that things like taking from the board, independent reading, independent writing, and viewing presentations are less well represented in your responses, which is interesting. And hopefully, as we learn more and calibrate that around our definition of engagement, we will find out more about why that might be. So let's do that. Let's calibrate that definition of engagement. At IRE, one of the pinnacles of our work with, or one of the cornerstones rather of our work with teachers and school systems, is our definitions of 3 key measures of instructional quality: engagement, alignment, and rigor. Focus of today's session here is on engagement, and here's how we have defined it through our classroom visit protocol, as well as our years of research and experience in the field. We say that students are, when students are engaged, they are on task, they're interested in the work, and they're actively processing information. They're listening, they're reading, they're thinking, or making something, or they're communicating information. They're speaking, they're performing, they're writing. And and those are valuable things for us to look for. And what they really speak to is the difference between playing school, right? Students can look like they're engaged. They can sit there with in distance learning with their cameras on and maybe look in the general area of the camera, but they could be looking off at another monitor. They could be looking at another device, but we have evidence that they're at least there and they're compliant, as what that first portion of the definition really speaks to, that they're playing school and being compliant. What we really want to strive for, and we know you as educators want to strive for, is that idea of doing school, that you want to provide some opportunities for your students to actively think about what it is that what they're doing. You're gathering evidence of some of that original thinking they produce. So when we're talking about engagement, and specifically in the context of this webinar, what we're going to focus on are those strategies that get students to actively process information, that get students to communicate in different ways. Anissa, I saw you I saw your face say something that you had to say, so please go ahead and chime in.
No, actually, I was just, we have a couple of people who have joined us, and so I put in the chat the website joinpd.com. That's for Pear Deck, along with the code in case they want to join in and have the interactive part of the session with us.
Okay. All right. So thank you for doing that as well. So that's really what we're talking about here when we're talking about engagement, is that doing school. We're zeroing in on how to get students thinking, how to get them involved with the work. So we'll ask you to revisit that warm-up prompt one more time with that additional information in mind. I want you to think about that second part of the definition and promoting active engagement. Which of these activities is most likely to promote students doing school? So again, you have 5 dots that you may drag to wherever you might like. Which of these activities is most likely to promote students producing their own original thought, their own original thinking? You may use 1 dot, you may use 5 dots, you may use no dots. Please go ahead and drag them and move them around and show us a little bit about what you're thinking of here. Okay, we'll give it just a moment for those dots to settle down. And what's really coming out for here through the second time through is a big focus on peer conversations. And I can infer that that's a lot of, well, what better evidence is there of students processing than actually saying what's on their mind, right? And a big concentration of dots on independent writing, showing us that, again, the students are really opening up their heads and showing us what's in their hearts and minds as they're thinking about that. Some of us, pretty healthy concentration of dots on recording a video. So if students are producing their own individual content, that's again some evidence of that original thinking, or same with performing an experiment. That they might not be original thinking, depending on whether or not they are either, whether they're devising their own experiment or doing something else, but they're certainly processing those phenomena, taking notes and seeing what's happening there. And all of those are great examples of active engagement. They differ some from some of the things where we're not seeing concentration of dots, like taking notes from the board, for example, because that note-taking is more of a compliance behavior. While it's certainly valuable, right? And we'd want students to refer to those notes a little bit later on. Unless we ask them to explicitly do so as part of our instruction, we don't know whether or not those students are actively engaged. We simply don't have the evidence to say that. So it was interesting to see that we did not have a large concentration of dots there. So that is some active engagement. We're focusing on those things, that what students, they give us some evidence of what students are doing, what they're thinking. And for this session then, as we go forward in the webinar, we want to look at a few different ways we can produce evidence of original thought and see how interactive notebooks can align with that. Also, one dimension where we look for this evidence of original thought can be in processing, right? We can ask students to process what they know and write a brief summary or annotate a text or a picture or create analogies that connect one concept to another. And certainly by creating non-linguistic representations, right? If you are drawing a picture to represent what you know, or you are capturing, you're using sketch notes to track your scientific design process as you go along. All of those are good processing strategies. They take thoughts, they put them in the neat packages, and it allows you to put your own original thinking back out into the world. Certainly in the case of an experiment or perhaps writing a longer essay, we get to that applying lane here that's depicted in the middle of the screen, applying information in novel context. So seeing how these scientific phenomena play out in a lab. Perhaps I'm designing a lab experiment of my own and seeing how forces work in motion and applying that to a novel context. And the other dimension we think about in evidence of original thought is reflecting. So ask students to think about their own thinking, whether that's journaling and tracking their thought process throughout, creating a think aloud to show us exactly what steps they're taking as they navigate a task. Metacognition, again, that thinking about that thinking, what they did well, what they didn't do well, what they'd like to improve upon, that sort of self-evaluative reasoning and self-evaluative exercises, as well as explaining their thinking or reasoning as well. So going in depth, talking about why I made some of the choices I did and why I didn't choose some of the alternatives, to really show that evidence of critical thought about the practices that we're in learning that we're engaged in. So all those three, the processing, applying, reflecting, are three different dimensions that we can take a look at when we're looking for that evidence of original thought. And what we want to do next then is look at some tools to support that kind of engagement and those levels of engagement. As promised and as billed in the title of this webinar, we really want to take a look at interactive notebooks. And we know the analog version of these has been around for a while. Whether you've called them interactive student notebooks, interactive notebooks, you've abbreviated if you're into brevity to ISNs or something of the sort, or iNotebooks in some curricula. They really boil down to the left side of the notebook being used as teacher input. So whether that is notes from the teacher, whether that is a reading that students are cutting and pasting or gluing on the left side of the notebook, some kind of input that students have to do something with is generally stored on the left side. On the right side is where students have output. They take that input, they turn it into a summary. They engage in some of those behavior, some of those types of things that we talked about on the last slide, where they are summarizing, they're analyzing, they're annotating, they're reflecting on what this means or how it might connect to something else they know, and that typically happens on the right side. And so you have this really neat progression of here's on my left what I learned, on my right side, here's what I do with it. And it of course gets organized by topic and I can statement, and we keep on going throughout that. What we want to focus on in this session, because it's likely novel to a lot of us here as we navigate the world of distance learning, is what does that look like in a digital setting? Chiefly speaking, we see digital notebooks used to contain a lot of that student output, but with some creativity and some tech savvy, we can incorporate some of those input pieces as well. And we hope to share some templates and some things throughout the remainder of the session here to really highlight what a few ways that might look. Anissa.
And thank you, Randy. And the other thing is I know we have a varied audience. So some of us are completely virtual, some of us are in hybrid, some of us are full-time back in school, although not as many at the moment. And so when we talk about digital, we know that we recognize that a lot of folks, even if you're in school full-time or if you're doing the hybrid method, that we're trying to cut down on supplies, right, on materials, on paper. And so doing a digital interactive notebook, even if we've got the kids us in person can also be really good with that as well. And if we're in the hybrid model, then that just really helps to lend itself that we can use it either when we're with the kids or when the kids are on their own.
Thank you. That's a great thing to point out too, right? Just when we talk, digital doesn't have to mean distance learning. Digital can mean in-person learning here as well. So as promised, when you joined and you registered for this webinar, we're going to give you access to your own templates, your own samples. Thank you, Anissa, for doing that. I was just about to, but you messaged that only to, oh, you did get it to everybody. Okay, my fault, I misread. So if you follow that link, you will get your own link to the templates we're about to go through. I'm going to switch my screen over to those in just a moment as you find your way there. And what we'll do is talk about a few of those different templates throughout that those three different modes of thinking that we talked about, give you a chance to see what they are and some different possibilities that we could use them for. And we'll also peel back the curtain a little bit to show you some of the tips and tricks and how the technical side of that, how to make that really work for you and your teachers or students as the case might be.
And guys, if you missed it, please look in the chat, open up your chat if you haven't, and the link should be right there.
Yep.
So let me know if you guys need any help.
Okay. So as you join us in your own personalized copy, that copy that hopefully it forced you to make a copy, and you have the copy you're here to play. That's all yours. You're free to play with, to annotate, to mark up. We want to go ahead and highlight a few of the different templates that are available to you here and some different ways you might use them. So one of the ways we most often see digital notebooks used, if you come with me to slide 2, is what we talk about how we summarize things, right? How we process things and how we grab things. Ask students to interact with either a text, an extended text, a short text, whatever the case might be. Slide 3 gives us a template to do that with. You have an opportunity to insert a screenshot of your text, or to put a text box in there, and in the yellow box down below, you have a chance for students to record their summary of that. In the template itself here, we don't necessarily prescribe what that summary has to look like. You might adopt that to be more specific to your grade level. It could be 3 bullet points, it could be a full paragraph, it could be 24 words, it could be 7 words. That summary couldn't be anything you want to look like, and that might be something that you want to customize a little bit later on to make it more appropriate for your students. But in practice, what we do is we kind of merge the input and output, so that input and output are together, are on one page on slide 4. So we have the background reading about a particular area in social studies here. We give our students an opportunity to summarize it down below, and that gives us the input and output all in one place. So that gives students a record of their thinking, and it gives us, when we push this out to students, some input or some insight into what they're thinking and how they're perceiving those things in the text. So at the most basic level, a digital notebook, just as it can in the pen and paper versions, can capture the input and output really well together, and can be an ideal marriage for that. If we come down to the annotations, there's a few different ways we can annotate things as well. So the next section on slide 5 is processing annotations, and slide 6 gives us another template that we might be able to work with. So again, in the middle, you have the opportunity to insert a screenshot or otherwise text box of your text, and you have a few annotations available to you around that. Things like the main idea of this paragraph is where students could then take on their own copies, drag the icons over on top of paragraphs, or they could go to "this is an important point" and say, yeah, that is an important point, I should highlight that. They could also annotate things like "I have questions about," or "this makes you think about," and make some other connections to the text. And that's done through the power of just adding some different shapes here on the sides that students are able to drag and interact with. So looking at that same background reading, I could ask them to use one or all of these bubbles to say, tell me about the main idea of this first paragraph, and they could tell me a bit about what happened there. If they had specific questions, say they don't know necessarily why why Daley wanted the capital of this town in Anaconda, they could write that, right? And that gives us an opportunity to clarify some of that a little bit later on. So it's a different way to use a tool that probably most of our educators and students are becoming more familiar with, Google Slides. But again, using that power of shapes to really make visible some of that thinking that students might be doing as they go throughout their learning journeys. Certainly in slides 8 and 9, we have an example of some different draggable labels, and on the elementary level, we know the water cycle is a big deal. And if we wanted to check for student understanding of that, we can do that. We can set up some different labels for them to have, tell me where evaporation is happening here, where is precipitation happening, and they can drag and drop those as they might choose to give us some perspectives here. The last thing we really want to highlight in terms of annotations, though, is the way different symbols and stuff might be used to annotate things as well. So when we talk about annotations, they can be of text, they can be of images, but it's also a nice way to record some thinking about peer evaluations. So we have here a rubric for a sample job interview, which we have as one of our supplemental literacy curricula. And what we ask students to do it throughout that is to rate each other essentially on their interview performance with some of the criteria that are outlined here. And in this version of the interactive notebook, we'd ask them to drive the thumbs up symbol over individual readings. And that gives us a quick idea of how they're viewing their peers' performance. And again, or we could ask them to self-evaluate as well. So that gives us some insight there, as well as the draggable X here, which gives us the opportunity to see, well, how exactly, what is the overall here? What do they see as the overall rating? So when we highlight that, just to bring up the annotations, we typically think of that as linked to page-based text and blocks of text, but we can do that a variety of different ways, simply through the magic of dragging a few symbols or shapes around. So before we go on to talking about analogies or anything like that, I want to pause and let Anissa, I've seen some chat notifications here and there. I want to see if there's anything lingering in the chat that we need to attend to.
Hi, Randy. No, I think that's good. I did get one message in terms of how to set this up. And so that's why in the follow-up email, you guys will get the templates themselves. But Randy and I are more than happy to talk with you guys off of this seminar about the actual ins and outs, the logistics of setting this up. These are all different types of templates. And so on what subject area you teach or what your use is, your interactive notebook may be just a couple pages, or you may add to it. And so you may start with like a text with those annotations like Randy showed, or with the summary bubbles. So it's a great way to get the kids started with just a couple of things to have them do, so that they really get that sense of how do I manipulate those pieces. So it's something different. Read and respond, read and respond.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's a different way to capture that thinking. And even though it echoes a lot of the same type of thinking we might do in person, what we have found, as we've talked with partners around the country, is that some teachers are really having trouble breaking that read respond loop, right? They're having trouble thinking of, well, how do I get my kids to think about in analogies, or how do I get my kids involved with the coordinate plane? Especially for some of our algebra teachers or pre-algebra teachers or so on and so forth, they're thinking, well, how do we practice these skills, right? And so we offer the digital notebook here as one possible solution to that, one tool to add into the repertoire, so to speak. So we can definitely think about it for analogies as well. Is blank is like blank because, and give students an opportunity to capture some of that thinking, so just some templates for that. Where some people have found more power is using this to really capture some thinking for lab reports, or to begin outline essays. So we might have my thesis and my body paragraphs outlined here. And then in this particular template, the teacher chose to have students hyperlink their body paragraph. So on the next two slides, 18 and 19, if I'm here on 17 and I want to read the first body paragraph, I can link it down there. Now, granted, that's not a way a lot of us typically write. We don't typically write in segments like that. And students now, with the advent of Google Docs, probably prefer to work in one doc at a time. The counter argument to that, though, is when we are really focused on one element of the writing. So for example, if we are really focused on just putting together a good introduction, or just a good body paragraph, it's sometimes helpful to view that measure in isolation, or view that segment in isolation. So some ELA teachers that we've talked to have said, you know what, if we're going to be workshopping body paragraphs today, for students to use these later in their final draft, I want them to just focus on that. And so a template like this can provide that laser focus for saying, students, by the end of the day, I need you to have a good body paragraph 1, a good body paragraph 2, or work on your conclusion today, and come back to that a little bit later on as a wood shopping map. Again, through the power of dragging things down on slide 20, we can have them create different maps, right? And have different shapes or digital dioramas to show where different icons are, where things are at geographically or in their neighborhood, or what the case might be. On slide 22, slide 21 talks about Think Aloud. Slide 22 is a video that's embedded here that you may not hear from me, but it's recording of a Think Aloud, and we include that to showcase another way that digital notebooks might be used. In a pen and paper notebook, we don't have the luxury of having a voice recording or putting that in my pen and paper notebook. But if I really wanted to get into a kid's head and really know how they're thinking and attacking processes, we can certainly ask them to record a video aloud, Think Aloud rather, using a video or audio, and ask them to paste that or paste a link to that inside their digital notebook, which keeps all that thinking in one place and gives us a uniform format to observe some of that thinking and provide some feedback on. The last template that's provided to you here, the last two templates that are provided for you here speak to metacognition and kids really thinking about their thinking and what they're doing and why and all that kind of reasoning, right? So in some cases, it can be a what, so what, now what debrief. We're at the end of a learning activity or at the end of a week, we simply give some kids to reflect, an opportunity to reflect on the I can statement and talk about what they learned and why it matters and what they'll do next or what connections they see, or if they're engaged in a process or a lab experiment, what they might do differently next time, or what worked well for me writing this paper or what didn't. And have an opportunity to write in those fields. And again, through the power of just simple dragging of shapes, we can take quick temperature checks on how they feel about that learning that week, whether or not they understood what they meant to do, whether or not they understood what they were meant to accomplish that week, whether they did accomplish that, and how confident they feel in talking to someone else about that. So that is a brief overview of some of the templates that are available to you. And as I talked about a little bit earlier, I want to give you some time I want to pull back the curtain a little bit and show some of the how this works and give some kind of, if not best practices, at least good practices to make it workable for you and kids. Before we transition and shift gears over to that though, I want to formally pause and ask if there's any questions in the chat, or ask you to really put any thinking out there into the chat about any of these topics or any of these different ways of thinking that you want to know more about. So briefly, just pause as you look at the templates or you go back through them. If there's any questions you have about how or why I might use a specific template, there's your time to ask that. If it's a how do I make that, we'll get to that in just a second. Well, a little bit of wait time here. And Nissa, you are more able to track the chat than I am. What are you seeing coming up, if anything?
So one of the things that has come my way is the grade level bands, and whether this is something that our younger kids can use as well. So my quick answer is yes. Oh, that's it. My quick answer, no. But I think that as we look at some of those, and as Randy was talking, what it really comes down to is another way of to get the kids to do the same kind of thinking and processing that we normally would have them do in person, but having them do that with some guidance on their own. And so with the interactive notebook, especially when done in slides, it allows those things like the draggables pretty easily. It also allows us to set it up so that the text is not, kids aren't able to mess with the text, but they are then able to continue to write or to annotate. Especially for not just our younger kids, but for all our kids, but especially for our younger kids, can be really helpful, and something that is a struggle with Google Docs, where if we give them a Google document, it's all open, right? It's all editable. And so, and PDFs aren't, the kids can't write on a PDF as easily, and especially for free, without having to buy an app. And so this is a way to try to do that, to keep some of our information that we're giving the kids safe from edit, while allowing them to do that application piece by interacting with it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you for clarifying that. They can be accessible to grade levels. Obviously, your older kids who are probably more versed in slides are going to have more immediate success with this. But even our youngest kids, should be able to, especially with some of the more simple interactions like dragging or so on and so forth, dragging pictures around. That's something they take to pretty easily. And I say that because my 2-year-old has figured out how to, open up and find pictures of himself in my phone and so on and so forth and so on. And so there is a learning curve, and that does need to be a supervised learning curve. And it might be worth, incumbent on you as the educator to say, to post a short instructional video or short clip that says, here's how we use this type of slide, or here's how we use these types of slides in our room, and here's how we want to use the draggable. But that might be helpful. So that might be a helpful support for students, especially at the younger end, or for students who this is completely new to in general.
Right. And I know, Randy, one of the teachers that I talked to that has used one of these, they started out by using it solely as a reflection journal. So it would either be something like that self-monitoring questionnaire like we have up on the screen right now, or something where they'd actually have to write down some things. But I that idea of how do we get the kids to dip into that if they're not used to using Google Slides or not used to doing this type of interaction with the text. And then they started adding in some of those, let's have the kids read and respond, or let me have the kids annotate, because that's a skill that we want the kids to continue practice, but is more difficult when we're talking about it digitally. So we can see what they're doing instead of having them have to print it out or us get them the hard copy somehow.
Okay. Want to make some space for any other questions that might come up, and because I know Anissa and I have been talking to each other for the last few moments and sharing some thinking. Want to make some space for any questions that we might have sparked for you before we dive into that. Well, okay, so how do I do this? As quickly and succinctly as we can here.
And you can feel free to either put it in the chat, or if you'd like to unmute yourself, you can do that as well.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about the how then. The key feature of Google Slides that we recommend that teachers master if they're going to do this effectively is working with slide masters. So if you're looking at my screen, I'm going to show you what that is in view and then master. If you're looking at the view menu, then clicking on the master button, master option here under that. If you're on your own screen, again, the view and then the master here. What that brings up is, if you're still in this presentation, it brings up a copy of some, at the top, it brings up a copy of some basic slide templates here, but also brings up individual copies of both the basic templates, but also the individual work like coordinate plane and so on and so forth that we have in our main presentation that we just navigated through. So what working in the slide master allows you to do is, as Anissa said, it makes it not fully edit proof, but it makes a barrier to editing or to messing things up, right? So if I were, for example, to place the background reading as the image of in the master, that means that students can't edit the text. They can't mess things up when they're editing outside of the master. So if I were to exit the master and go back to the regular slide, I can't edit this reading. I can't click on it. You can't click on it. You can't do anything to it. It is static. It stays there. Then all I need to think about as a student is not how do I mess this up and how do I make excuses for, well, I didn't see the reading, or I deleted the reading. I didn't know how to get to it back. All I have to think about as a student is I need to write here. So as I go back to the slide master, some other things to keep in mind is you'll notice that, again, just thinking about this summary tab here, the bottom portion here is grayed out, and we did that pretty intentionally. What happens is if I put a text box here into the slide master, and if I gave a specific space for you to respond here, if I were to come back and exit out of the slide master, and that is not a spot that you might be able to play with there. So that text box is can give you some other opportunities to interact with the text as well. So there's another way you could do that. If you to give students an opportunity to interact with that is incorporating the text boxes through the Slide Master in order to show, give some space for that.
And Randy, another thing that we've learned from some of our teachers that have used the interactive notebook is that idea of, if you notice on Randy's, it's yellow where they can, and it's that color coding piece. So that if we're asking them to do, to answer something or, do some type of writing or summary, it's always a particular color. It doesn't have to be yellow. This was, selected as yellow, but the teachers have found that that's really helpful as well, because it really helps to give the kids the key to say, okay, here's where you stop and process and write. Whether that's in a graphic organizer or whether it's a summary at the bottom of the page, like Randy just showed.
Mm-hmm. And that same principle applies throughout here, right? Explicitly where we wanted or we made some space for students to think. Those spaces are very clearly delineated in yellow here, but certainly you could adjust that to your heart's content. The other thing we wanted to be mindful of is that for each of these labels, don't panic that you don't see them here on the slide preview over here in the left-hand column. They do show up with you to work with over here. So if you were to add them to the Slide Master, they are there. They just don't show up in the slide previews as well. So it's another just thing to be aware of as you're going forward. And certainly, if you wanted those to make those labels specific, as we did on slide 9, right? You wanted to, rather than relying on students to type up of evaporation, precipitation, condensation, collection, you could do that in the Slide Master itself, write in each label, so students are then able to drag those specific labels around rather than trying to guess at what each part is and how to spell it. So providing some additional scaffolding support to students in that way. So in short, at the most basic level, you're working a lot in Slide Masters, and that's just like you're building a slide. And that in Google Slides, you can, a normal slide rather, you can input text boxes, you can input images, so on and so forth. What the Slide Master affords you is that it's not as easily editable by students, especially if I were to kick it out to them through Google Classroom. It's less likely that they're able to mess with the diagram or accidentally delete something. And so they're actually able to do the thinking that we want them to engage in. Some other things to keep in mind is, yes, there's a lot of templates here. And we did that to give you a variety, but you may not want to use all of them, certainly in one course. A practice we would recommend is to certainly think about a notebook for the course of a unit or the course of a week. So students have all their activities or work in place for a week or for that unit. So you might want to pick and choose which activities and beg and borrow and steal. We wouldn't necessarily recommend a wholesale copy of this particular document for you to import to students. But certainly to beg, borrow, and steal and choose. And so we provide some excellent templates here. There are others out there as well you might be able to use to help supplement that knowledge. So that is that. Use Slide Masters. That's the big steering point. That's what kind of eliminates some of the user error. And feel free to customize, right? And customize what makes sense for you and customize what makes sense for your kids. As I transition back over to the main presentation here, I want to pause briefly one more time for any questions you might have or any clarifying questions we can answer about some of the how-to before we go forward.
Randy, I think one of the things that the interactive notebook really helps to address as we're thinking about that engagement definition is obviously we're having synchronous sessions, or if we have the kids with us in person, we can do those peer conversations throughout, whether it's breakout rooms or in partnerships in our classroom. When we think about something that you had mentioned that a lot of us put dots on, which is that individual writing is really another way to allow kids to communicate. And as Randy had mentioned earlier, that idea of trying to get out of that loop of read, respond, and do something a little bit different, interact with differently. That's what interactive notebooks will help do. That's the part of the engagement that it can really help with in terms of how do we get the kids to engage in the work when they're doing it on their own. And so that allows us to do some directions, to have them interact with text or with diagrams, whatever that might be, in a meaningful way. But having them able to do that on their own when they're not sitting right in front of us, which I know has been a frustration throughout this fall for everybody.
Absolutely. And so that is the reason we want to highlight interactive notebooks here, because they provide an opportunity to facilitate that active engagement. That's the underlying theme of the webinar here, right? That we want to think about how we get students doing school. And even in person, doing school the same way over and over again can, have some engagement, present some engagement issues as well. So before we close here, we're going to ask you to think about, for your own edification and your own purposes, what do you see as some possible applications of interactive notebooks in supporting learner engagement? So think about how that might work for you. Think for a moment about how that might support your own learners and their engagement. And as we march toward 4:30 here, we want to make some space for you to either put something out into the room as how you see, as in regard to how you see notebooks supporting engagement. And also, again, one final questioning opportunity for you to ask any questions of anything of Anissa and I before we close here today.
Randy, somebody asked a good question of do the kids need to, do they use the slides in presentation mode, or do they use that in the editing mode? Like how does that work with kids?
Good, fair question. Typically we think of slides as a presentation software. In this case, it's not that, right? We're using it for the notebook. So as we think about our how-tos and our modeling and what we want the kids to do, they're rarely, if ever, going to touch that presentation slide, presentation button, or that present button. That's not for us up here. They're going to be sticking mostly in that editing mode. There may be a case, however, where we want to ask students to present some of their thinking. And I want them to, for example, to present some aspect of their presentation to a small group, or of their lab report rather, to a small group. I want them to track their own hypotheses and test some hypotheses, or test some observations with kids. So it could be that I have them in small group breakouts and have each student present just this particular slide from their notebook, right, to present that particular thinking. So those instances might be fewer and farther between. It's chiefly going to be a spot where they're editing and they're tracking their own thinking, but it does have some applications for that presentation function as well. As we come to close here today, we do have a few minutes left in which Anissa and I will stick around for any other questions you have, or just you want to chat and you want to know more about us and how we're doing. You can feel free to stick around and say hi for a bit. As you leave the Zoom here today, or the Zoom call webinar here today, there will be a feedback survey that pops up. It gives you the opportunity to give us some feedback about how we're doing here and whether or not we met your expectations. What else you'd like to see with us in terms of topic from the future. Each of you that does complete the survey will get a printed certificate offered to you in a follow-up email, just as a token of your attendance here. So you're able to record that for whatever professional learning needs you might have, or whatever documentation you might have. As part of the survey, we do ask you for an exit ticket. And that's the first question that pops up for you there. And the exit ticket today is, as you think about implementing interactive notebooks, what are some skills that might need to be taught to students so that they can make effective use of the notebooks? And so that harkens back to some of what we talked about earlier. Do they need to know the difference between editing and presenting? Do they need to know how to drag symbols around? How do I need to do that? What are some of the other, we'll give that exit ticket is a spot for you to capture some thinking about what else I need to be able to teach kids to do this well. Because as we pointed out earlier, especially our younger kids or kids who are not familiar with Google Slides, this might not come second nature to them right away. So that does give you an opportunity to record some of that thinking. We are, like I said, quickly approaching 4:30 here. We'll give you back 9 minutes your afternoon, unless you have any more questions or anything you want to share with us or you want to speak with us about. We do welcome you for your attendance and your thinking here today. It's been a little slice of heaven, and we look forward to seeing you next time in our next webinar.
Thank you, guys. And don't forget, as soon as you log out, as Randy said, the survey will pop up, and that'll be the very first question is the exit ticket. And that's where you can write down some of your ideas of what the kids will need to know, what kind of skills will they need to know in order to really use the interactive notebook effectively. So thank you guys so much. We appreciate y'all being here and look forward to seeing you at our next webinar.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thanks.
Thank you.